President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Fireside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. But we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higherside Chats.
Here we go, Higherside Chatters, drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood, and today's show is one I am very, very happy with, because I like to try to do things that are a little bit more unique, a little more fringe, and this idea of a hollow earth, which on its surface sounds immediately ridiculous and too large of a secret to keep from the world in this modern age, is really interesting to me. And these elite have had an ironclad handle on this planet for centuries. And today's guest, Dean, tells several stories of royalty in the 17 and 1800s, sending explorers up to the North Pole to investigate the strange things they had been hearing about. And there's so much more. But Dean and I talked for hours the day before the show trying to plan out the best way to present the information. And we put a lot of thought into making a good case. And we kind of go chronologically through the material. I mean, we talked today about subtle disclosure of certain Black Ops projects and technology through Hollywood films, and the ones that contain these nuggets are pushed a bit more by the establishment. But before movies, we had books, and we have the Lord of the Rings series with all these interesting lands and beings taking place in Middle-earth. That's a strange name, isn't it? But maybe he was hinting at the middle of the earth. Or H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where beings come up from the cavern worlds and wreak havoc in a future time on the earth. And not to mention the countless tribes and cultures that have these types of stories. It's just a fascinating, mind-bending possibility. And to me, Dean is a great guest for it. He tackles all the elements of science and physics that would need to be addressed, and he really doesn't shy away from any of the questions. So we do spend the first 30 minutes discussing the original source material of the Vedic texts and the Purana and the Bhagavad Gita to hear how the earth was described by these people that talk about the previous yugas. And a lot of it has to do with how much stock you put in ancient texts being literal descriptions of the world they lived in. We have been taught to write them off as fiction, myth, and fantasy, but maybe that's a way to keep knowledge suppressed, especially if this knowledge hints at where the real power on the planet may be held. But if you're not into strange descriptions in ancient texts, skip ahead 30 minutes in, because that's where it really gets fun. And Dean explains the science and geography of the Hollow Earth theory, so start there if that's more your thing. But the only other little anecdote I'd like to throw out before we dive in is that people sometimes ask me if I'm concerned that I might get shut down or visited by the Men in Black or something, and I don't worry about that at all, honestly. And nothing strange has ever happened like that, except once. In my quest to find a great Hollow Earth guest, I found a woman who had just a very minimal amount of information online, but I contacted her and we talked back and forth for a while, and she wanted to do the show and she was excited. She sent me her book with a personalized message that read, "Dear Greg, may the unwavering urge to shine a light in all dark places always be your goal. Best wishes." And this book is huge, guys, over 350 pages, and it's the size of a screenplay with very small type. And it talks about so much, and these massive cover stories and this apparent truth of beings in the earth that are very close in contact with the ruling elite, and they all agree to maintain these secrets. Well, I was so excited for the show, and an hour before we were set to go on, she messaged me and said that every few years she's asked to talk about this, and when she does, something very bad happens to her or the people close to her. And she told me that that was the case this time as well, and that something very serious and sudden had happened to a loved one of hers that she's very close with, and she seemed to think it was connected to her agreement to broach the topics and talk about her book, and she apologized, thanked me, wished me the best, and asked me never to bring up her name or book on the air, and that she'd have to end our communication. Now, if this woman had seemed paranoid or off in any way, this would have made more sense, but she was very sweet and well-spoken. But this very topic is the only one that has ever seemed to put one of my guests in danger. So take that for what it's worth, and let's get weird with the professor of the Hollow Earth, Dean Dominic DeLucia. And if you listen to this and it prompts any questions from you, or you think a piece of the puzzle just doesn't fit, jump on the subreddit, leave a comment on the Hollow Earth thread for this show, and I'll get Dean back on, and I'm sure he'll be willing to answer anything you can fire at him. He's been researching this for a long time. So let's do it. I've been talking long enough. Here we go with the Hollow Earth theory and Dean Dominic DeLucia. All right, people, we know our reality is a carefully crafted framework of smoke and mirrors designed by a long line of corrupt elite, and it causes one to wonder just how much we know to be true is actually a product of this manipulation machine. And as we go deeper, we're constantly shocked to find that things we thought we knew were true are actually anything but. Well, today we're looking into one of the most fringe topics resting soundly at the deepest depths of the rabbit hole, and that is the theory of the hollow earth full of life, strange beings, creatures, cities, and a hidden paradise. And our guest, Dean Dominic DeLucia, is going to help us make the case for this possibility over the course of this extended THC. Dean is a university-trained translator with a lifelong interest in Indian and Hindu philosophy and Vedic astrology. He's the author of several books, including Astrologica Vedica, The Beatles and Vedic Astrology, and of course, Hollow Earth in the Perennius. He's been speaking and writing about these ancient texts for quite some time now, and I couldn't be more pumped to have him here. Dean, welcome to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to speak with you and with your listeners.
Yeah, man, this is real exciting. I've been wanting to do this show for quite some time. Entertaining the Hollow Earth is a scary thought because we know there are a lot of lies and tweaks to the many aspects of history and life in general, but we assume that at least our basic understanding of the planet is pretty well established, and to find out that the reality might be radically different from that has some pretty serious implications for everything we know. But I am excited to present the evidence to the people. Hopefully we can make a pretty strong case that changes people's ideas of what's possible. But let's start out by describing the Vedic texts and explain where they came from, how old are they, these types of things, for anyone not familiar with some of those terms I threw out in that introduction.
Well, let's see. The Vedic culture came to an end with the Battle of Kurukshetra, the Bhagavad Gita war, the war that is depicted in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna spoke with Krishna on the battlefield. That was about 5,000 years ago. The Vedic knowledge was common within that society, and it was compiled when things started going downhill, when the culture started falling apart and disintegrating. And those are the four Vedas that we have in India. However, the four Vedas are very ceremonial. They're a little bit technical. And there are other, branches of the Vedic literature, specifically the Puranas. And the Puranas are historical narrations. They're very similar to the Old Testament, the stories of David and Goliath, Ruth, Rebecca. It's reading the Puranic narrations. It kind of reminds me of reading the Old Testament. And it's there that we find mention of the Hollow Earth.
Interesting. I mean, these texts, obviously, they're, I guess, compared to Sumerian texts, are these considered to be older? Because we're talking 5,000 years, and that's just when they were written down. I mean, there might be an oral tradition that extends longer than that.
Yes, well, in the literature itself, what you see is that the Vedic society on Earth, which was once very much encompassing, it fragmented to Druid, to Indo-European, to various cultures that we know, that we think they're separate or similar, but they're ramifications, they're branch-offs. But yes, I don't see them as being older than the Sumerian. It's just that this knowledge is presented as something that's cyclical. Sometimes it's wiped off the face of the earth and is reestablished again. What we see in the literature is that they are shepherded by this demigod culture, by these celestials that sometimes appear within the society as great warriors or great teachers or great proponents of medical science, that kind of thing. So it's eternal. Probably you've heard of the Kalki avatar. Mm-hmm. So Kalki comes at the end of every yuga cycle, consisting of 4 yugas. Right now we're in the last one, the Kali Yuga. It will come to an end in 428,000 years. At that time, the Kalki avatar will appear, and he will bring with him men from the inner earth to repopulate the surface world. So in this way, it's cyclical. It may disappear for a while, the Vedic understandings, but they're manifested again. That's the idea. So when you talk about age, I mean, how can you talk about age when that's the ideal, that it's something cyclical that's manifested again and again?
Sure, that's definitely a fair point. And these texts, they kind of describe the earth and life and even humans much differently than we consider them today. Can you tell us about those aspects of the story?
Yes, but they describe it all in stride. You know, I mean, somebody might be reading, for example, the history of the American Revolution, and then as part of the reading, you'll hear about the Atlantic, and you'll hear about the British, and you'll hear about France, and the French fleet came, and this, that, and the other. Well, in the same way, it's not. The point is not to describe these places. People knew about these places already, and in the same way, these Puranic texts, they describe narrations that have their own points, but as part of the storyline, the hollow cavity of the earth, the other side of the earth, is also described, because they're also involved with goings on the surface, and vice versa. They go back and forth, just like we go back and forth across the Atlantic. So they're described, but they're described in that way. It's kind of in stride.
Yeah, kind of like it's just it's given knowledge. And that is interesting. But don't they talk about a cloud layer up in the sky that seems very different than the clouds we have now, right?
Well, this was the idea, and you can see it described in the Bible with this idea of 40 days rain and 40 nights of rain, that there was a cloud mantle around the earth, and that it protected the beings on the earth from the radiations from deep space, and allowed human beings to grow taller, to have better brains, better memories, quicker thinking, and to have greater longevity also. So this is one thing that was described in Vedic times, that there was a cloud mantle, but when the Dwapara Yuga came to an end and the Kali Yuga began, the cloud mantle disintegrated. Now, let me make a point here also. We know that Venus does have a cloud mantle. That's for sure. Yeah, we can observe it. And what we're told, for example, is the Venera 9 probe in the middle of the 70s, a Russian probe. They had several Veneras, went to Venus, of course, orbited it, and dropped down a small probe that passed through the atmosphere of Venus. A parachute opened up. It spent 45 minutes floating down through the Venusian atmosphere until it landed on the surface. Now, what they tell us is that because of the cloud mantle, that Venus becomes superheated, heated up to 950 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this gives us the idea that life cannot exist beneath a cloud mantle. Mm-hmm. But, I take all of these claims by space agencies with a grain of salt. I don't see how, a parachute can drift through an atmosphere, especially a wet atmosphere with, clouds and whatever, at heated at 950 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
It would burn up, it would melt, or something like that. So this is something that's always surprised me. And I think that, there's scope for accepting a cloud mantle around the Earth without automatically aping and just automatically accepting the orthodox, astronomical scientific explanation that no, this would kill all life because it would superheat the surface and whatever. I just thought I would mention that.
Yeah.
There is a cloud mantle. I mean, it's described, but I think that civilization lived within it, you know.
Right. I mean, it is super interesting to think about the world being so different. But I mean, obviously, these texts have been translated many times over. And we were talking the other day about how they can be interpreted and how they relate to the Hollow Earth idea. And you made a good point about a translation being confined to the understanding of the translator. So, of course, if a translator hasn't been presented with some of these ideas, it can easily create warps in the translation, which we've seen in certain descriptions of weaponry in the Bhagavad Gita, for example. But how does this translation issue apply to what we're talking about now?
Well, certainly there are translation of these Puranic narrations that don't mention the Hollow Earth aspect of the story at all. And there are others that mention it, which you know, is really a stark contrast, to say the least. Mm-hmm. But I would certainly say it must be hard for these translators, especially in the face of the modern concepts of our planet, the configuration, let's say, of our planet, to just all of a sudden jump up and translate that, oh, the earth is hollow. This is what our scripture says. They may feel that this would be threatening to their scripture, that their scripture would be considered as poppycock or something like Greek mythology or whatever. So they hide these things. Maybe they're a little bit ashamed or something like that. But it's certainly there. The descriptions of the hollow earth and even cavern worlds are certainly there. Now, you mentioned the point that these texts have passed through, you know, the hands of one translator to the other until they've reached us in modern times. And this brings up the idea that perhaps some changes were made to these texts, yes, and, you know, maybe some exaggeration or something like that. But I'll bring up an interesting point. Of these Puranas, there are 18 of them that are especially prominent. There is one which is a little bit different. It belongs to a certain community of Brahmins in India, and they've kept it up, let's say. They've maintained it well. What is said about this Purana is that it has no interpolations in it, that it's a closed book. You know, it was written in Vedic times, it ended in Vedic times, it didn't continue, it wasn't updated, and specifically it's written in that same Sanskrit of the Vedic era, and you don't find further comments or, as I say, these interpolations which involved post-Vedic Sanskrit or much more recent Sanskrit. So what you find in the Bhagavad Purana is actually very genuine. The impression that everyone gets is that it's it's the real McCoy. It hasn't been touched. It hasn't been fooled with. It's written in the same script, you know, that kind of thing. And it does mention these Hollow Earth narrations, these Hollow Earth pastimes. So that's kind of a control for us when we look at the work that other translators may or may not have done. So I was thinking I would bring that point up.
Yeah, that's definitely worth mentioning. I mean, can you tell us about some of these areas in the text where they do discuss interactions with other beings on the planet? And are those interactions, like, are they happening mainly around the times of massive Earth changes, the changing of the yugas, or like popping up here and there, or is it more of a sustained relationship?
Well, I would like to jump into that part, but let me just make a comment on what you were saying, for example, about some of these exotic weapons that we see mentioned in Bhagavad Gita and other literature. What we see mentioned are arrows that seek and follow their prey, which remind us of missiles, guided missiles, heat-seeking missiles, for example. We're also exposed to the idea of UFOs, aircraft with UFO flight characteristics, you know, the fantastic speeds of the UFOs and the way they stop on a dime and make right angle turns and that kind of thing. We're also exposed to voice-activated weapons, voice-activated arrows, arrows with a mantra on them, which is programming, such that they will do what they were told.
Mm-hmm.
So when the British first went to India and started translating these texts, it was just, it was Looney Tunes for them. It was just some crazy, wild, unacceptable description of a culture and whatever, obviously. But nowadays we see these kinds of weapons, So all of a sudden it doesn't seem that far-fetched. And when we think about the Vedic culture and these Vedic descriptions of the hollow earth, let's keep in mind what the Vedic culture was. It was a culture that had a written language, which is much more sophisticated than our languages today, of which, let's say, Latin, German, the Indo-European languages were fragmentations, simplified forms of Sanskrit. They were developed in terms of astronomy and calendar systems. They were developed in terms of mathematics, and we're talking about certainly algebra. So these are not just like the Yanomami Indians of Brazil that have some folk legend about the hollow earth or something like that. These were actually at least the Brahmin caste. They were very educated and had a lot of information and knowledge to their credit.
Right, and that is definitely worth acknowledging. It helps strengthen the case.
Sure, definitely. Now, the interactions with other beings do not seem to be related at all to earth changes or specifically to changes in yugas. I would say no. I would have to say no. I'll run a few of the narrations by you and try to just give the gist. Sure. And you'll get a feel for it, and then we could take it from there. Now, we spoke about the Bhagavad Gita, for example. The Bhagavad Gita is so well known. I mean, I remember being in, 11th grade literature class, and we studied Siddhartha, and we also studied Bhagavad Gita, the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. And I had taken up transcendental meditation, and I had read the Maharishi's Bhagavad Gita. I had read the Christopher Isherwood Bhagavad Gita. Timothy Leary quoted from Bhagavad Gita. It was that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so it's an Hindu literature that is known to us. So, my God, we talk about Vedas, the Rig Veda, and we talk about the Puranas. Who knows what in the world those things are? But maybe you remember high school studying the Bhagavad Gita like I did, or maybe in transcendental meditation class. It's a point of reference. Mm-hmm. So, Bhagavad Gita is part of a larger literature called the Mahabharata. Mahabharata has something like 64,000 verses to it, sentences to it, lines, shlokas. So that's incredible, for one thing. It's very large. The Bhagavad Gita is only one chapter in this whole narrated history of the times of the Krishna avatar. And what we find is that a few chapters before the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna was speaking to Arjuna's older brother, who was the king whose kingdom had been usurped, and on whose behalf Arjuna was going to enter the fray, the one army against the other, and try to recover it. But what Krishna was chatting with him about was the inner earthers and how they had made all of them, the entire inner earth, had made an alliance with Arjuna's opponents, who was Duryodhana. That was his name, his Sanskrit name, Duryodhana. And that they were going to be really formidable opponents. So this was just, as part of the chapter, some of the developments, the things that they were talking about as they were discussing the coming battle. And the hollow earth, as I mentioned, was mentioned in stride. So that's one example. But there's a nice example of an encounter that the Krishna avatar had. There was one point when he was living in his city, Dwarka, which is supposed to be off of the coast of Bombay, let's say, but a little bit north of Bombay. Now it's supposed to be submerged on the continental shelf. But there was a spectacular jewel that had been stolen, and one of Krishna's associates was involved. His name became besmirched. And Krishna wanted to set things straight. So he went with a few of the townspeople to follow this path through the woods where the carrier of this jewel had been killed and the jewel disappeared. They found this place. They went a little further, and they found a lion that had been killed. And apparently the lion had killed the messenger and taken the jewel. That's the way it's described. If human beings were more intelligent in those times, so were the animals. Conversations with birds, for example, appear in the Puranas. But,
weird.
Yeah. But in turn, the lion had been killed, and the jewel was not with him. And somehow or other, the Krishna avatar understood that it was taken by Jambavan to his underground lair. And Jambavan is described as a rickshaw or a bear, a huge bear. Although I've also seen him being translated as a gorilla. Well, whatever. But the Krishna avatar went to the cave entrance, told his associates that they should go back to Dwarka, that it would take a long time for him to go through the cave and come back. They insisted on waiting, and the Krishna avatar went through the tunnel system. Well, it did take many days. He spent many days down there. Actually, he ended up visiting. And they did become discouraged and confused, and they went back to Dwarka. But what happened was that Krishna spent days going down through the tunnel until he came to a cavern world. And it's described that the home of the rickshaw, of the bear, Jambavan, was there. And this is from where we get the word jumbo from Sanskrit, because Jambavan was extremely huge. He was like a giant. And Krishna entered the home, and he went into the playroom of Jambavan's boy, and the boy was there playing with the jewel that had been given him to him by his father as an article to play with. And it's described that the nanny of the boy became very frightened, and she ran away and screamed. And soon Jambavan appeared in the room and became very angry because he felt that his boy was being threatened or something like that. And they went outside and they battled. And they battled with maces, and they battled for actually many days until the rickshaw became weakened. He was actually like Hanuman, the monkey warrior, the great devotee of Ramachandra, who is another avatar. Because he was also, this rickshaw was also a great devotee of Rama, of another Vishnu incarnation. And he was very powerful, and he realized in the middle of this combat that the only person this could be is a Vishnu incarnation, because nobody else can stand up to me and fight for days on end like that. So he stopped the fighting, and he questioned Krishna, who are you? Are you a Vishnu avatar, and that kind of thing. And Krishna had his enjoyment, played how would you say, kind of a prank, transcendental prank on his devotee, and they became friends, and he spent a few days there. And Jambavan was very happy to give back the jewel to the rightful owner so that things could be set straight and whatever. And Krishna went back to Dwarka. So this is very interesting. It's not like we see some lair that's just a cave with bones lying around or things like that. It's described that there was a home and that there was even a nanny. This is just very unusual.
Right. I mean, these texts are really interesting to talk about, and the stories are pretty cool, and they do have technology described that sort of matches up with modern days. But for a lot of people, when they hear about these texts, they kind of write them off as folklore or myth, not to be taken literally. And I mean, things like conversations with animals, those are hard for people to think of as literal truth. Do you think we're supposed to read these as literal stories?
Well, I certainly do think that it's a great barrier. It really is. But to say that this took place in a different yuga is to say it took place in a different world. You know, it took place in a world where there was no radiation from outside, where people were very telepathic, where mantras were efficacious, where they were like incantations, you know, that would manifest their results right before your very eyes, manifest from the astral plane on the physical plane. This would take place especially through fire and their fire sacrifices. I just think I think it's a real barrier. It really is, and it's something that I became accustomed to over years, and something that I accept as typical of those times and of that atmosphere, the physics of the planet at that time. But I just, you know, I have to kind of maybe leave you right there and just say it's a real barrier.
I understand. It's one of those things. You can only tell the stories, and people have to make a decision on how literal they want to interpret them. But before we get too deep into this conversation, I'm hoping we can give people a good visualization of how the Hollow Earth researchers generally see the planet, because we're so used to the crust, mantle, solid core concept that seems so set in stone. Can you give us a better understanding of the composition of the planet from this alternative perspective?
Well, let's see. The planet has an outer shell. All right, let's start with the shell. One thing that you would have to discuss is how thick is the shell. Now,
right.
Now, if you accept Newtonian gravity, if you accept that gravity is dependent or corresponds to the density of mass, then you come up with the problem. If the shell is too thick, the idea is that the shell, the gravity be emanating from the center point of the planet. The idea would be that if there's a shell and a cavity within, that the shell would come collapsing down upon itself, that it would fragment and break. So this is one problem that's posed. And then if the shell, that's the shell. If it were too thick, all right, that wouldn't happen because the structure would maybe be strengthened. But then you have a very small cavity, and you have particles from the sun that bring heat with them, that bounce around on the inside. They would heat up the cavity to an unbearable temperature. And if there is, if the inner sun, so to speak, we call it a sun, if it has any nuclear component to it, a nuclear element.
Radiation.
Radiation. I mean, how can you have radiation in an enclosed space like that with just little openings at the polar extremes? So this is something that has to be worked out. Gravity has to be understood. You have to change physics to look at a hollow Earth planet. You really do. You have to throw Newtonian physics out the door, and you could just imagine what that is. You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because it seems like Newtonian physics checks out mathematically. It seems like there's a lot of implications about orbits and mass and all that kind of stuff that's kind of over my head that smarter people than me seem to be in agreement with. They seem to have worked it out mathematically. So, the implications of the Earth being so different are huge.
Well, you can make any description that you'd like through a language, even the language of math, and you can write fiction in English, you can write fiction with math. So when we're talking about the orbits, they have to make up masses and invent mass in order to make the celestial mechanics, Kepler's laws, and all that actually function. And then they say, well, this planet must have a massive nickel core, and the other one, it has to be, maybe, I don't know, I'm speculating here, but tin, a lighter metal,
right,
because
right.
and like that, yeah. So they
plug
make
in the
that
holes.
up. Yeah, they plug in all the holes. So don't take that too seriously. But then one thing that becomes very interesting is if you see gravity as gravity effects caused by electromagnetic force. This becomes very interesting because it doesn't depend on density of matter, and also penetrating down into the crust of the Earth. You can expect the radiation to diminish, or even for its frequency to change. I mean, think about a radio. You take a small radio, like the old Walkman radios or whatever, a transistor radio, and you go into a building, which is a big building, maybe with some thick cement walls. And then in the lobby, maybe you're still receiving, you can hear your music. But then if you go into the interior of the building, you've got so many walls, so much matter between you and the source of the radiation that you can't receive anymore. You can't hear your radio. It doesn't get through. It doesn't work inside. So gravity would be like that. On the outer surface, the gravity effects can be very pronounced, but as we penetrate through the crust, through the shell of the Earth, we would expect gravity effects, if gravity effects are caused by an electromagnetic radiation, we would expect the radiation to drop off in intensity and gravity effects to diminish also. So this would mean that you could have structure in the middle of the crust without any weight. You could have mass without weight, or without much weight.
That is interesting, because I have had some guests on the show who've claimed to reverse engineer UFO craft or to have made it on their own, and they talk about that. They say that there's a electromagnetic relationship to gravity, and that is how crafts are able to hover and turn on a dime, because they're using some type of force or harnessing some type of energy that we don't consider in our everyday life, and it insinuates a fundamental misunderstanding of gravity. So it is interesting that you would equate gravity to that, because it does show up in other areas too.
Yes, definitely. I'll go along with them. What you're seeing when you think about UFOs is repulsion. Gravity actually does exhibit repulsion. It's like two positive poles of a magnet going against each other. There's repulsion. And there are even, like monorail trains that are elevated above the surface because of magnetic repulsion. Well, magnetized particles, they also have positive and negative poles. They also have canopies, like a magnetic canopy around their particles. Very similar to the electromagnetic effects. Very similar. I mean, same thing basically. So there you have it, the Earth emanates this electromagnetic radiation, and the atom has a net positive charge. They say the atom is neutral, but there was one scientist in the early 20th century. What was his name? Lippincott. And he came up with some experiment that proved that the atom has a net positive charge. And he was poo-pooed about it and just kind of scoffed aside. And later on, they made up to him, and he won the Nobel Prize for some relatively unimportant discovery that he had made. But that's why our feet are firmly planted on the ground, because the atom has a net positive charge. But then if something has a negative charge, like a UFO or a cloud, clouds are full of electricity. That means they're full of electrons. That means they're negatively charged. Then to the degree that you're negatively charged, you're going to float.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you again, for the skeptics, trying to get them on board, some of the hardcore rationalists, the scientists out there, are there any unresolved issues or discrepancies in conventional ideas of the Earth's geology or physics that are resolved by the Hollow Earth model?
Any discrepancies? Well, I would say so. I mean, you have the idea, the orthodox idea that the inner Earth is a dynamo, and that this is you have different spheres rotating on top of each other, and it creates some dynamo effect, and there's electricity. There's magnetism generated also. The magnetic canopy around the Earth is generated in this way. It's not such a tenable theory. Mm-hmm. First of all, you have strata of the Earth, which is all molten rock, And then if you have a dynamo effect, you have magnetism being generated from the center of the Earth. How could it pass through these heated layers? Because heat destroys magnetic properties. And so much magnetism that it envelops the entire Earth, in this magnetic canopy, and it's so strong at the poles. Their dynamo theory for producing heat and energy to drive geological processes and to produce the magnetic canopy, it's not very tenable. But think about a hollow Earth with openings at the polar extremes. What you actually have is a solenoid. Solenoid are used in switches, electric switches, especially in cars, like ignition switches. And the idea is that a charged particle with a north and south pole, a positive and negative pole, with openings at the polar extremes, and which is hollow, a solenoid, when it spins, it generates a magnetic canopy. And there you have something, proven science, that, and there's no contradiction that says, well, we haven't figured it out yet, but in the future we will know. There's nothing like that. If the Earth is hollow with openings at the polar extremes, it's a solenoid. If it spins, it's got a magnetic canopy. That's, all there is to it. And then what about energy and heat to drive geological processes? Well, this could be accounted for by particles from the sun that pass through the Earth but get caught up, say, in hollows and in openings and spaces between different strata, between continental plates and the rock below it, for example, and they build up there, just like batteries. They store heat. The particles get trapped there. And then you have electricity within the Earth. When these explode because of sunspot activity, solar flares, and excess charge of electricity building up within the Earth, when it reaches a certain point and they explode, just like a battery that's being overcharged might explode, then this would account for earthquakes, for example.
That is interesting. And a lot of this does tie into that idea of the light particles from the sun and how we think about them a little bit differently. And I know the farthest out aspect of this is the idea of the internal sun. And that's where a lot of people call bullshit because it seems so foreign to our understanding. But, you've explained it just now, and you explained it to me in a way the other day that made it seem more reasonable, that it's more like a loose collection of light particles that pass through the outer layers of the Earth and illuminate the inner cavity, rather than being a sun-like star or anything like that. And I guess what's weird is people just have to think about the idea of light particles passing through the Earth, which, it's outside of my expertise to know if that's rational or not, but I can visualize it. It seems to make sense.
Yeah, well, this is another obstacle to overcome. Something has to be understood. How do you get light within the crust and the cavern worlds? They're enclosed. And then you've got this hollow cavity, which is very big, but the openings are actually relatively small. I mean, they don't let in a lot of sunlight, not at all. So how do you get sunlight? How do you get heat and warmth, to make vegetation grow? within the hollow earth. A hollow sun has been, how would you say, stipulated, theorized, because it's been seen by explorers, Arctic explorers, who approached the pole. During the Arctic night, the explorer Nansen, for example, who was knighted by the King of Norway for his expedition in the 1890s, he made 2 very significant expeditions, and one of them had him graze the opening. And in the Arctic night, they saw the sun on the horizon, a copper-colored sun on the horizon, but it was on the wrong horizon. It was on the wrong side. And this was a couple of weeks or something like that before the actual sun of the solar system was supposed to rise anyway. So in the middle of the dark night, they're wondering, what is this doing here? You know, how do we have this sun on the horizon in the wrong place?
Yeah.
So we know that we know there's a sun in there. That's the idea. But then what is the sun like? It's been described as being copper-colored. The idea that we have from the descriptions, take it or leave it, of Olaf Jansen, who was a young Norwegian boy in 1848, who actually made it in, let's say, with his father on their fishing sloop. Not a very big boat. There were only 2 of them. But he described the sun as being also copper-colored, as being kind of nebulous, and nebulous in the sense that it looked like an agglomeration of particles, and it didn't look like the sun of the solar system that has a very well-defined disk, a very well-defined edge to it. It wasn't like that. The edge was, it was an agglomeration of particles. What would be the idea here? What do we theorize? We theorize that electrons and all the particles that come from the sun, they're all electrons, they're all negatively charged, that they are composed in the ultimate issue of photons. They are photon aggregates. That's how we would describe electrons. This coming from a hollow earther named Joseph H. Cater, who he was more active in the 50s and 60s. He's elderly now.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that aspect of it is super interesting, but I feel like we've done a pretty good job of explaining it, or mainly you. But let's go through some of these stories. I mean, you mentioned the expeditions in the Arctic, and I've heard you describe some pretty strange navigational behavior near the North Pole on some of those early expeditions to discover it, and you equate that to the false assumption that the Earth is a sphere, where in reality at the North and South Poles they sort of sink in like big punch bowls long before you get near the actual pole or the hollow earth entrance. Can you tell us about those early expeditions and that aspect to the Earth's geology?
Well, I can, but perhaps you'd give me just a few seconds to wrap up very quickly what I was actually driving at.
Sure.
With these particles that pass through the Earth. When they make it to the hollow portion, some of these particles, they get captured and they bounce around, they break up into their constituent photons, and that's how you have this omnipresent light that manifests in the hollow cavity. And they, in the ultimate issue, they congregate in the middle, and that's how the sun is formed. Maybe we should go to the outer surface then, and
sure.
Speak about the contour of the planet.
Yes. So
the idea that people have of the planet is that maybe it's like an egg on its side. The curvature of the Earth tends to flatten out until it becomes completely flat at the North and South poles. Mm-hmm. And this is true to a great degree, but if there is a hollow Earth with openings, then what we actually have is a basin. It's like an hourglass, which is thin at the neck, but the outer edges, the inward grade, the inward slope or angle, starts out very, how how you say, not very acutely, and very slight, and then it becomes acuter as it gets closer to the neck of the opening, like an hourglass, and then it would open up within until it takes on the contour of the inner surface. So this is very important. It has to do with navigation, because the Arctic explorers in the 1800s were always getting lost. They were always getting lost because they didn't know about their latitude. They were not on an outward sloping latitude. The whole Arctic basin is a basin. The whole Arctic Ocean is a basin. It's an inward sloping basin. So your grade is actually turned inward, such that when you use a sextant to calculate your position, you end up making some huge errors. And this showed up in the logbooks of Dr. Cook, who claimed he discovered the North Pole, but who was ridiculed because as he approached the pole, he spoke about making progress of something like 48 miles, 53 miles a day. And that was, of course, ridiculous across the Arctic ice. And then a few years later, Admiral Peary was awarded the honor of having discovered the North Pole. And his logbook made more ridiculous claims along the same lines. As he approached the pole, he was making speeds of up to 73 miles a day across the ice. So the admiral, he got the prize, and the doctor, he got ridiculed and treated very, very badly. But what makes this happen? You're going up a certain slope until you reach the outer rim, which the outer rim is actually flat. And then when you start edging downward and going inward, something happens. It's the same effect that you would have if you're in an auditorium which is dark, like in the movie theater, and you have the ushers with these flashlights in their hand. And when they flick their wrist, they can cover just a little bit of distance, but it gives the impression of having covered a large distance across the ceiling of the auditorium. So it's something like that. You travel a few miles, and the grade becomes very sharp. It goes from outward sloping to inward sloping. And when you project this against your celestial navigation, it seems like you just made 73 miles of progress that day. So this means that you're getting over the hump, and you're really going down into the sharper angle of the hollow earth opening. But you don't realize it because all you see is flat land stretching out, all around you. But your navigation will tell you that you're getting close because the inward grade is getting steeper. This is one effect of the inward slope. People get lost and they report these speeds,
Right. That's a good explanation, because I think for me, when I first started hearing about the hollow earth, it was hard to visualize, to get a solid grasp on how those pole openings work, because I think the first thought would be that it's kind of like coming up to the edge of a massive cliff, and it's nothing like that. It's seems like almost like a big hill in the ocean, and you go up, and then you start coming down the other side, almost like the momentum of a roller coaster.
Right.
Is that accurate?
I would go along with that. But to give you an idea of the slightness of the grade, at least in the beginning, right above Ellesmere Island. In fact, it must have been they were still on Ellesmere Island in Canada, which would have put them. This was who? This was Admiral. This was Admiral Peary. He wrote 4 years in the Arctic North, in the White North, something like that. But what he recorded as they were traveling northward, that there was foreshortening of the horizon, and he mentioned a mountain, he mentioned a hill. So he was not on the ice yet. He was still on Ellesmere. This puts him 500 miles away from the North Pole. And what he said was that they would see the tip of this mountain or this hill sticking up above the horizon in their binoculars. So they would say, okay, that's 9 miles away, the horizon, and they would head towards it, but they would arrive very quickly, like maybe after 6 miles. And this tells us that the slope, the angle of the curvature is already has a downward and inward slope to it. But by the time you get to the North Pole, I mean that's a very slight slope. It's not very sharp at all. No, it's not like a precipice. It's not like the edge of a cliff.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't a visual show, but if anybody is second guessing this information or thinking, we have people out on an international space station, why can't they see this? We have satellite imagery of the Earth, why can't they see this? You actually can. If you Google hollow Earth polar opening, you can see video and photographs of a strange opening at the North Pole. And in the age of Photoshop, it is really tough to know what is real and what isn't, especially when you're looking at random images. But I've seen some pretty convincing images in your slideshow presentations, and I wish people could see that right now.
Well, one thing that I'll say about orbits is that almost all orbits are equatorial orbits. So it must be very hard to get a good view of the hollow Earth. You'd have to be above it to really see the opening. So that's one problem. There are very few satellites that have polar orbits. They're mostly military satellites. And there's one satellite clip which is labeled AMSA, AMSA, and they tell me it's a Japanese weather agency, something like that. It's their satellite. There are several clips like it, but what you will see above Greenland, between Baffin Bay, say between Greenland and Ellesmere Island in Zemlya, this would be called Nova Zemlya. What you see is a round circle, a round whitish circle. Now there are white smears all across the Arctic, but this one is always there in the same place above Greenland and between these two opposite points from the pole. It's always there, and it's always very circular. But the white is different. And the way I would interpret that is that you have warm, humid air coming from within, it's warmer, to the outer polar air, which is extremely frigid. And of course it condenses and forms fog. And this fog reflects a different color to it, has a different tint to it than, say, the ice, the surrounding ice, because the ice is thicker, denser, whatever. So that tips us off. It's in the area where all the Arctic anomalies have been noticed that indicate that we're close to an opening. Near the area where the polar explorers always noticed that the animals are migrating for the winter, but they're migrating northward. From that area where they say, well, the wind is blowing, but when it comes from the north during the winter, it's warmer. And then the ice on deck starts melting. From that area where the pollen clouds come blowing across the entire ice scape and cover the entire surface with pollen, this orangish pollen, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we think the opening is, and that's where we see this whitish disk. Yeah. So that's fairly good evidence right there.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I like that it's able to be backed up by some of those satellite images. It's super interesting and contradictory to everything I've ever been taught. But we've kind of bogged the people down with science and the knowledge of the ancient texts, and we're about at the halfway point of what we were going to do here. Let's look at some of the stories, the massive amount of anecdotal evidence that the Earth is different, especially around those pole areas. I think a lot of them are a good place to start. They come out of what's typically known as the age of exploration. When Europe got their ships out there, the 1400s, 1500s, is that when we start to see these stories coming out?
Well, Greg, just let me give your listeners a tip about satellite quality satellite evidence.
Sure.
There's the RadarSat program. And that is a known program. It's a European Space Agency program. What it did was very well documented. Everything that it did was published. They have a website. They did radar mapping of the entire surface of the Earth, including the ocean floor. And, you know, that's some evidence you can sink your teeth into instead of saying, well, there's this clip going around and what it shows, and it looks like it's in the right place, but, you know, it says it's AMSA, but we don't know really where it's from. I mean, when it says you go into the RadarSat, you're really in the middle of the whole RadarSat program. And the RadarSat images of the southern Antarctic opening are really very, how would you say, very indicative. Very indicative. You can see the slope very well. You can see as it gets darker, as you get towards the middle of the opening, and the slope gets steeper. Because, of course, the radar is not having good resonance because the slope, I mean, in the ultimate issue, it goes sideways, you know, it doesn't reflect back up. So that is some good quality evidence, satellite evidence, if they want to look up some of the RadarSat hollow Earth opening, that, you know, if they Google that kind of thing, they'll find some good images there.
Okay, cool.
But you were talking about the age of exploration. Maybe you want to know when it all started?
Yeah, is that when we see some of these strange accounts start to form?
Well, apparently the Eskimos always had contact with the Scandinavians, and their folklore told about the world where it's always illuminated and there's no darkness, because that's another aspect of the hollow Earth. I mean, it's you're not going to have darkness down there. So that's a separate issue. But they had their folklore, their information about this world, because they were inhabitants of the Arctic Basin, you know, so they knew what was up there. And the Scandinavians, they've always had their folklore going back, you know, this is before the Christian era at least, talking about their gods, their demigods, Thor, who is Jupiter, you know, the land of Thor, where the people are giants and where the sun never sets, and the land where there's no horizon. So these concepts were always known to them even way back then. So that's one point of reference. Another point of reference would be Leif Erikson, because he founded that colony in Greenland right at the turn of the millennium, at the end of the 900s, you might recall. And that was a colony that flourished very much so because of the support that came from Europe. They sent a boat or two every year to bring supplies and things people couldn't manufacture. And that colony went on for years. Now, the bubonic plague beset Europe in something like the late 1200s, and they were not able to maintain contact with their colony in Greenland anymore. This was between Greenland and North America. It was on that side of Greenland, the colony. And in the meantime, the Scandinavians had passed the control of the colony to the Danes, because the Danes were a bigger, wealthier, or more populated country, and they could handle the expenses. So they stepped up and took over by that time. But the contact was lost, and something like a couple hundred years went by. And then just like maybe 50 years before the Columbus discovery, people started to wonder, well, whatever happened to this colony? You know, we left these people there. There were hundreds of people there. What if they flourished? What if they're still alive? What if they still speak their Norse language? You know, we have a Christian duty and that kind of thing. And they sent a ship. And the ship found the remains of the colony. And they were able to communicate with the Eskimos and ask what happened. And the Eskimos told them that the Vikings ended up trekking up towards the north across the Arctic ice to the inner world where it's always illuminated and the sun never sets and all that. So that's another point of reference. Even from before Columbus, they were coming back and saying, well, they went into the Hollow Earth,
Yeah, that's crazy. And you mentioned Scandinavia, which, of course, I've heard you talk about the origins of the Santa Claus story, which come from that region. And there's a tie-in to the Inner Earth, possibly. Would you like to tell that anecdote?
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. The Santa Claus folklore. The idea is that this holy person comes with elf-like creatures. I mean, who knows? Maybe they were Eskimo helpers or maybe actual elves. But he came from the inner earth, from the north, and he was a great mystic. He was a holy man and a great mystic, and he would come on this huge sleigh, and he would bring supplies and food and things to help the people during the winter. And he, like any holy man, I guess he lived for others and believed in charity and that kind of thing, and he helped the people. And this is one of their myths, and this was the whole beginning of the Santa Claus myth, that Santa Claus came from the inner earth. Amazing.
Yeah, it is funny when you tie it into that. But now, if we
how about the Smithsonian Institute? That's all Hollow Earth right there. It was founded by Smithson, a Scotsman, who after the Revolution bequeathed a great fortune to the establishment of these museums and also a sum of money to fund an expedition to go to the Arctic and find the opening to the Hollow Earth, to explore it inside and to bring back examples of its fauna and vegetation, and to display them in this museum that was built. And that was the first museum, the original Smithsonian Museum. So the whole Smithsonian Museum was built in order to showcase the findings from the Hollow Earth when they got back from their expedition. Can you believe that one?
Right, and that's funny because there is an author who just recently put out a book. I was supposed to have him on the show, but it isn't able to happen. He's fell ill or something. But he wrote a book that is all about the Smithsonian's cover-up. Richard Dewhurst. He wrote this book about the Smithsonian's cover-up of any artifacts that come through about giants. They seem to take them in, but they never reach display. They always seem to get lost, and then they seem to go missing or become hidden. And that's interesting because these giants are thought of to possibly have come from the inner earth. We hear stories about them in various ancient texts, and there's plenty of myths about giants, but apparently that's where they might have came from.
Yes, and not only the cavity, but also from cavern worlds. These giant human beings, they've been seen in other parts of the world. Who was it? Captain Cook, not Dr. Cook, but Captain Cook, the English explorer. He ran across one of these giant people. I think that they're supposed to have been 8-9 feet tall, a tribe that was living in the Andes Mountains. But down there in Patagonia, he was able to actually capture one of them. And but the person jumped off the ship in the middle of the ocean when they were taking, after they had already put to sea. And who knows what happened to him, but they couldn't recover him. So that's one example. And then we have the Amazon warriors that were encountered by the Spanish expedition headed up by Orellana. And I've really looked into that one, and it's very much for real. They had a chronicler with them. They had a church friar with them who, had studied and who was literate and whatever. And he was writing down a report, keeping a log of the whole expedition. Sensible man, educated man, religious man, not apt tell lies, we wouldn't think. And they had to battle their way as their two boats went down the Amazon River from the Peruvian headwaters towards the Atlantic. And around the middle, let's say, they encountered, this would be near the city of Santarém in Brazil. If you look on a good map, you'll see that city along the Amazon River, a little bit above Santarém. They encountered, they became engulfed in this battle with Indians, an Indian tribe, and there were many of these Amazon ladies among the Indians, and they were the ones marshaling the battle and giving the orders and running the whole show. And they were described as being very muscular. They were much more muscular than their Indian counterparts, and they were described as being a palm taller than the tallest Spaniard. That's for those times. Mm-hmm. But a palm would be something like 8 inches. So 8 inches taller than the tallest of their people on their expedition. There were 50 of them. So you can imagine these ladies, they were, maybe from the shoulders, people would come up to their shoulders maybe, or maybe just below the neck, just below the shoulders. That's also possible. Yeah. So there, I mean, and they are described, they are related to cavern worlds, the Amazon warriors, these lady warriors, the female warriors. You may not realize it, but Christopher Columbus on the island of Guadalupe, he was told by the Indians that there were lady warriors that lived in the caverns inside the earth, and they would come out sometimes and battle and kill and take hostages and things like that.
Whoa.
So they seem to have had their underground aspect too. Because you don't find them; they disappeared.
Yeah, interesting. So let me bring us back to this era of exploration a bit in the 1500s and that kind of era. It seems like if there were discoveries and an orchestrated effort made to keep information from the public, because clearly, the powers that be, the shadowy elites that run the planet, they have to know this information and keep it hidden. And it seems like that would be the era where, at least among a certain level of leaders, it seems that that's where that concerted effort would start to happen. I mean, are there any stories from that time that jive with that idea?
Well, there was Sir Martin Frobisher during the times when Elizabeth and Drake were terrorizing the seas, and Frobisher was one of them. He was one of her sea captains right up there with Drake. He was commissioned to go to the Arctic and to explore the Arctic shores. And he was given a map, the Frobisher map, which shows the Arctic shores, basically, but it shows some inner shores. And the idea you get is that the person was passing through the opening, and then when you pass through the opening, what you see around you, because, you're coming through a hole and then it opens up down below, and what you see around you was the other coastline. There was another coastline shown in the map.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's that. And then there was Henry Cabot, another explorer who was searching for the Northwest Passage. Well, he disappeared, but supposedly he was poking up there. And then when they were searching for the lost Franklin expedition around 1850, all of the explorers, especially the military rescuers, especially the military ones, were warned about not going up above and across the Arctic. They didn't want them to go poking around up there. There might be some reason for that, but certainly when you get to the explorer, I just mentioned his Nansen, a Norwegian. I mean, he wrote down everything that says hollow earth, hollow earth, hollow earth. Here's the opening. but he didn't come out and say a hollow world, you know.
Mm-hmm.
His ship came very close to the opening, and as I mentioned, they were the ones that reported all of these warm temperatures. They were the ones that found mammal life in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, not even once they came close to Greenland, but on the other side of the opening, when they were really in the middle of the Arctic. And there was no food chain for these mammals. They came across what you call them, wolves. They came across wolves. They came across very large hare, rabbits, you know, and also land birds, also seals. And these things are not supposed to exist in the middle of a frozen ocean during the winter, of all things. And I've mentioned already some of the anomalies that he found. But just to give you an idea of how dramatic it was, there was one point where he separated from the ship on a sled with dogs. He and he and one of the crew members, and they went towards the North Pole. They wanted to conquer the North Pole. But the ice was there were ridges, ice ridges, and they couldn't make it, and they had to turn back. But this was in March, this was in April. Now April, let's say 100 miles from the North Pole, is very frigid. I mean, the temperatures are supposed to be so cold. 20 degrees below zero. I mean, those are the typical temperatures. I mean, even in April, don't think that because it's April, it warms up. It doesn't warm up until maybe July, a little bit before July and a little bit into August, and that's all there is. And then it starts very quickly getting cold again. But what Nansen said is that he couldn't get to sleep at night, and they were having trouble with their sleep typically because the temperatures were too hot. And he mentioned that during the day we set up a tent and we got underneath the shade because we were being scorched by the heat of the sun.
Wow, that's not what you would think would happen up in the Arctic Circle.
No, it's not. And then there was Perry again, who at the very top of Greenland was reporting temperatures of 50 degrees and a warm wind coming from the North Pole in February. Now that's the worst month of winter. And he was very close. I mean, he was at the top of Greenland. He was only a few hundred miles away. Now, that's impossible. At his base camp, which he was 200 miles away from his base camp was Toul, where they have the Air Force base now. They reported temperatures on the same days, which were not 50 degrees, but way below zero.
Man, yeah, that's interesting. So I guess let's fast forward. Let's bring it up to Olaf Jansen, which was in the 1800s.
1800s, right?
He seems to be. This is like where the majority of the information about the inner Earth seems to come from. He seems to be one of the few people who's gotten in and gotten out and told the tale. Right? You mentioned him a little bit earlier, but let's get into the meat of what he saw down there, what he described, because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Olaf Jansen, I mean, I don't argue from the platform of Olaf Jansen, although I have great faith in the book, because you just can't prove it. Nobody's even been able to prove the birth certificate of a Norwegian named Olaf Jansen, and his father was Jens Jansen. And even he died in Los Angeles, and it was already in the 1900s. He was very old. But that hasn't been, nobody's been able to substantiate that either. And this was like 1910 or 1911. How do you get hospital records? And you don't even know which hospital. It's just in Los Angeles somewhere from way back then. It's very unsubstantiated. But his father took the boy on a fishing expedition. They went to Spitsbergen. They went to Franz Josef Islands. And let's say from Iceland and then over towards the actual above Russia, They went laterally. And then he told his boy, let's go to the land of the Norwegian gods. Let's go to the land of Thor. and let's go check it out. I guess his father was a little eccentric, and and I don't know what kind of fits the boy's mother was going through when they disappeared, but they went across towards Siberia, and he also reported the warm winds, and he reported this mock sun being, off the bow, while at the same time they were seeing the sun of the solar system off of their stern. And that the further they would go, it seemed like the higher up the sun of the inner Earth rose, while the sun of the solar system was falling below the horizon. In other words, they were nosing inwards. And they finally made it in, and they described a Mediterranean climate, and that they sailed along for a while, a few days, and they came across a ship. And it seemed to be some kind of tourist ship, and the people were singing songs, and it was the hugest ship that you could ever imagine. I mean, for him in those days, who knows? Perhaps nowadays we have ships that would be similar in size. But they were discovered by this ship on their little sloop, and very quickly let's say a type of captain's launch or something like that, or a lifeboat or whatever, was launched by the ship with no apparent ropes or anything like that. It was just lowered, and it very quickly approached them, and the people were giants, and they had beards, and they were very friendly, and they made nice offers for the two Norwegians to come with them on their boat and go back to the ship. So they jumped off of their fishing sloop and went with these people. And they quickly went back to the boat, and they were brought up, and there they were on deck, surrounded by these Hollow Earthers. And the Hollow Earthers were the same race as they were, the same as the Scandinavians.
Nordic looking. We can see the Nordics and the Russians as being maybe spillage or offshoots or wanderers from the Hollow Earth that lived in the Arctic shores, perhaps before the Cloud Mantle fell, and it just became separated from their homeland. But these people were Nordic looking. They spoke a language which Olaf Jansen said he later on realized was very close to Sanskrit. He said that his father, who was 6 foot something, 6'4", 6'6", only came up to the belt buckle of the shortest of them. Oh my God.
Yeah. He said that they were very elegant, and they had ease of manners and grace that only comes with good breeding. And he was treated very nicely. He mentioned trees. He was taken on tours. He mentioned trees that would dwarf the redwoods of California. He mentioned mammoth that also would dwarf the elephants of the surface. He mentioned that an apple was the size of a man's head. He mentioned that a bunch of grapes was as tall as a man. I think he means a man of the surface. That the fruit was much sweeter tasting. That the seeds were smaller. And he was even taken to see the king or the emperor of one of them. And they were treated very nicely. Their ship was filled with, or their boat was filled with gold, and after 2 years they decided to go back to their destiny and their world on the surface. He tried to go northwards. They had some problem with the winds working against them. It was the wrong season. The earth breathes. So they decided to just follow the wind down the southern side and come out that way. And that they sailed out of the Arctic Ocean and sailed into the Indian Ocean. This suggests that actually, although it's covered with ice, that Antarctica does have a channel going through it, or did. And at any rate, their ship had a problem on the Indian Ocean. They were still very close to Antarctica, and especially since it was too weighty with gold. And the ship the ship sank. It went plop, and it sank, and his father was quickly drowned. His father was below decks or something like that, and the ship sank like a gold weight. I'm not going to say like a lead weight. And he was lucky enough to make it to one of the icebergs. They were sailing through icebergs. And about 2-3 hours later, he saw a whaler ship, and he was picked up by the whaler and taken home. And he was seen as being rather crazy and had some problems. But
wow,
that's his story.
That's interesting, man. That's those detailed accounts of the fruit and the beans. That's pretty interesting to me. I guess one of the most famous accounts, anyone who's heard of the Hollow Earth has probably heard of the Admiral Byrd story. And I was a little surprised to hear that you don't put much stock in that story because for the lack of evidence, maybe similar to Olaf Janssen's story. But can you give the cliff notes to the Admiral Byrd story for people who haven't heard it? Because it's pretty interesting too.
Well, there is a positive side to the Admiral Byrd story. There were trailers in the 1920s when there were silent movies still of Admiral Byrd having discovered a continent in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And this had been spoken about, either continent or huge island, because of the mirages they were seen, you know. And of course, this Admiral Byrd, he did this on an aircraft. He explored in an aircraft, and the aircraft had a camera on it. And there was a film clip showed in the trailer of supposedly the Hollow Earth. And now the Hollow Earth movement, let's say, has been around for a long time. Every generation has picked up the banner and carried it. And we still have a couple of old-timers that are around that were from the 1970s and the 60s. And they knew about these trailers, and they did their business. They interviewed some people who were very aged at that time, who remember being very young and remember hearing about a continent in the Arctic, and they remember seeing the trailer and the films and the vegetation and all that, and their names were given and where they lived. And there was publications back then. One of them was Mary Martin's The Hollow Earth Hassle, she called it. And there was like a monthly magazine with Hollow Earth information on it, and some of these interviews were published. So that's something positive about Byrd.
Yeah.
But then there are other things about Byrd that just don't make sense. There's one Harley Byrd, who's supposed to be his nephew, who rescued the logbook, Byrd's logbook, from his historic Discovery flight when it was in the coffin, and he was there for the viewing before the burial, and he picked it up when no one was looking and slipped it into his suit pocket. And then he was going around in North America to these what do you call them? You know, congresses and expositions.
You were on a speaking tour?
Speaking tour, yeah, and showing this diary and speaking about the Hollow Earth and all that. And you know, you can't substantiate that at all. And the guy's disappeared. And, you know, does the Byrd family speak for him? Has he ever gone to where the Byrd family lives? And the descendants of Byrd say, oh, yes, this is Harley. He's our cousin or something. Nothing like that. No substantiation at all.
Yeah, that is a shame. But was his journal did it supposedly contain any descriptions of what he saw on his
his journal
expedition?
I don't know if there was exactly a journal. I mean, this is just Harley who says that there was a journal and that he had it with him. There are other problems with Byrd, though, because he was supposed to be on this naval expedition, Operation High Jump, in 1947, which went down to Antarctica and explored. But at the same time, while the expedition was down there, he was attending events He attended one event. This was discovered by Dennis Crenshaw, who has a Hollow Earth site and who is a longtime Hollow Earther, and who wrote an article about it. He has the newspaper clipping. Bird was up in New York attending some public function. So, now that's not impossible because they had a couple of aircraft carriers involved in that expedition. And there was one aircraft carrier further down and another aircraft carrier halfway to Melbourne. And I imagine they had supply ships going back and forth. And I don't think it would have been impossible for him to, as they were making their way down, for him to go back to the States and spend a week or two there, getting instructions, and maybe he attended some event too, and then he went back down when they were approaching the continent, But these things are contradictions, and they haven't been explained very well. So,
what did his expedition find? Were there any interesting details about the inner world or anything?
I can tell you the only things I've heard, and I didn't tell you this before, but the one I got this from was my father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my father he joined the Navy in 1936. He's an original plank owner, original member of the cruiser Brooklyn. And after World War II, of course, he was still in the Navy. He stayed in until 56. And he was on that expedition. And the way this came to my attention is that during the Barry Goldwater campaign, I was just a little boy, and Johnson was running these ads against him where it showed this big nuclear mushroom cloud, and it depicted Goldwater as being irresponsible or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mother and father were talking about Armageddon and what could destroy the world. And he was talking, he brought up this expedition. And she always got on. She got on here. This was the first time. I was really about 8 years old. I remember the house we were living in then. And she got on him about how, there you go again with that stuff that you were on the Bennington. But when you got back to Australia or something like that, you wrote me a letter and you said you were on the Philippine Sea. So, and then you always said that you were on the Philippine Sea, and later on you did a tour on the Bennington. And he was swearing that no, I only served on the Bennington. I was on the Bennington twice. And she would say, well, I wish I had kept that letter. I don't know why you keep saying that. And I don't know why, but he didn't want to say that he was on the Philippine Sea, which is the one that went down there. But he told her at this time when we were watching this commercial on television, it was in the afternoon. I remember everything that happened that day. And he told her that the pilots, they went down there and they investigated, and they flew because there were reports of Nazi UFOs down there, or flying saucers, or some weird contraptions like that. And they got jumped, and we lost a few aircraft, and they came limping home, and they landed, on the deck, and we had to hightail it out of there. And I remember him telling her, she was trying to ask, well, what was it? What did they find? And he was saying, well, it was sort of a depression that they're in. They're in a depression there, and that's where they were staying. And he didn't have any exact information because, come on, he was a chief petty officer. They didn't tell him about it, But there was scuttlebutt on the ships, and that's all anybody knows about, that these aircraft went down there, and a lot of aircraft, and they were encountered by UFOs. They were treated abruptly. They opened fire or something like that. There were exchanges, and they really got whipped. Lost aircraft.
And see, I guess the prevailing theory is that these were Nazi crafts. I know there's a lot of weird occult themes and strange technology that surround the Nazis, and they took a lot of interest in the poles. Some even think Hitler did escape to Antarctica. Do you think they were aware of the inner Earth?
Well, it's funny. They sent the expedition to the African side, New Schwabenland. There were 2 or 3 large ships, and they did have a couple of seaplanes with them, and they did do a lot of exploring, but they were on the wrong side. They were exploring because they were looking for the entrance to the Hollow Earth. Exactly. Why they couldn't find it in the Arctic, why they didn't decide to scour the Arctic near to home, because there's so much folklore about an opening in the Arctic. That's something I don't understand, why they would go down to Antarctica. But, okay, they did that. That one New Schwabenland expedition is well documented. But as far as the Nazis establishing a base down there, the New Schwabenland ships didn't establish any bases. They were not exactly cargo ships that had tractors and cement and bulldozers and things like that. And then when you ask people, well, how, what is this about a Nazi base in Antarctica? They always talk about U-boats that went down to Antarctica and carried supplies and things like that. They call them U-boats because they were boats. They weren't ships. They were very small, really. If you've ever been on a World War II submarine, because they have a lot of them that you could go on tours, but they're not very big at all. They're like 3 or 4 PT boats long. That's all, So how do you put supplies on one of them? They don't have a cargo bay. And how do they have enough fuel to get all the way down to Antarctica and back? They could make it to New York and back, but they couldn't make it to Florida and back or to Texas and back. The few times they did that, they would go in a pack of like 5 or 6, and then the one submarine would give half of its fuel to the one that was designated, and then that submarine would go back, and then the other ones would accompany, and they would all give it fuel until they got to a certain point, and they would come back. And then the one that was the last submarine was down there around the Florida coast with full tanks of fuel, and it sunk a few ships, and then it came back. That happened a few times. But that just goes to show you, they didn't have the range to go to Antarctica and come back. They couldn't even make it to Florida.
Yeah, that makes it suspect. So to get into these, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I want to get into some of these really interesting, far out stories about the inner earth or beings from the cavern worlds. One that you told me the other day that I thought was really interesting was a story about the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1920s. What's the deal with that story?
Well, let's see. That was a Russian division. That was a division. It was not just a few Russian soldiers, and they were fighting a pitched battle with Afghan, freedom fighters or whatever. Good Lord, that stuff's been going on for so long in Afghanistan. Yeah. If it's not the Russians, the Americans, But they got the best of the Afghanis, and they cornered them, and the Afghanis went running into some cavern that they found in the side of a mountain, and they penetrated it a bit, this cave, this long cave, and they came across beings in there. They came across these almas, the abominable snowman types, and these abominable snowmen threw rocks at them over long distances across from the chasm or whatever, and they were very accurate, and the Afghanis became a little scared, and they shot back, and they retreated, but they covered their retreat. They fought like a backwards battle with these abominable snowmen in their habitat, and they came out of the cave and they surrendered to the Russians. And as they were being processed right there and then and there and interrogated about, where do you come from and how many are in your force and that kind of thing, one of them came out and said, I'd like to tell you about, what we encountered in the cave. There were these beings there, these abominable snowmen, described them, and we shot some of them, and we know we killed some of them, and they're probably still in there. If you go in there, you'll be able to find them. And he did. This general, his name was Tobolsky. he sent some people in, and they retrieved one of these abominable snowmen bodies, and they came out, and everyone was marveled about it. They had human facial features, but they had animal hair all over their face, and their face was kind of reddish colored, but they looked like men, they only got one. And what could they do? There was a doctor with them, and the doctor did not an autopsy, but an examination. He measured their fingers, the width and the length and things like that. He described their nose, and he took measurements of that, 1.5 centimeters long from this point to that point and all that. The size of the head, the skull, the girth of the legs, the thighs and all that, the height, the weight. And they couldn't, they were on the run. They were in the middle of a war. They didn't bring the body with them. They left it there. But this was published somewhere in Russia, and it was rescued by the writer of Forbidden Archaeology, Cremo.
Michael Cremo.
Yeah, that's where everyone got that from, because it's been in some archive in Russia all this time. But Cremo was the one who retrieved it.
We had Cremo on the show about 2 months ago. That's awesome.
Yeah.
He's a good guy.
Well, another one who ran across a being like that was Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes, we've heard that story on the show before.
Oh, okay.
Really, really weird. But yeah, it's a person of such stature to talk about that is pretty interesting. I wanted to ask you about another guy, probably the weirdest story yet that I had heard was, I think his name was Jim Bowen. He was he was around that area just after World War II, I think.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that story? Did I get his name right?
Yeah, that came from me. That's for sure. So I didn't know that it made the rounds and had still survived. Actually, I mentioned Cater to you, right? Joseph H. Cater, the physicist who wrote about hollow earth theory, physics, and whatever. He is, he was active in the 60s, writing about the hollow earth. And he was approached by Jim Bowen, who said that he was on an expedition which followed the Operation High Jump in 47. This was a little bit later, that he was about to get mustered out of the Navy, but they asked him if he wanted to volunteer for a mission which would take the better part of a year, and that they were looking for patriotic people, and if he wanted to do something for his country, then perhaps he would be interested. And he volunteered, and he was taken on a ship, of course, down to Antarctica. I don't know. I think they were ferried from the ship to a certain place. Yes, they were, by aircraft. So there was an aircraft carrier. And they were equipped, 100 of them, to make an expedition. And they marched across the ice, a little less intimidating than flying, fighter aircraft into the hollow earth. And they marched for, I believe he said he was with them for 3 months. And by the time the 3 months went by, they pretty much marched into the beginning of the opening. They marched into a place where the ice started melting, where green grass started manifesting, where there was always fog, but it was light. There was 24 hours light. It was light, illuminated fog. And he said visibility was never more than 50 yards until they got way in there. And it opened up, and there was, countryside and vegetation and hills and whatever. And that they came across a being which was something like a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they just kind of crept backwards and, soft pedaled out of there. And of course, they were armed. I think they probably would have been able to handle it, but they weren't chased or anything like that. And at that point, they divided. There were 50 that went ahead and 50 that went back, because the 50 that went back, they helped by bringing supplies, something like that. They passed on what they had to the others, and they went back And that's all he knows. They didn't
the
tell.
50
Yeah.
that didn't go back, or did they ever come back?
Well, I didn't hear you. It broke up.
Oh, did when they split, did the other 50 ever come back?
Apparently they did, but he wasn't given contact with them. They were kept separate, and they ended up going back to Australia and then back to California, and he was discharged and thanked even and everything like that. And years later, when he found out about Cater and what Cater was writing about, he was thinking, well, that's it. That's where I was. And he hooked up with Cater, and they formed a friendship that lasted for a long time. Cater even went on vacation with them into Colorado a couple of times because he lived up in that area. Jim Bowen did. And Cater spoke very fondly about him. I spoke to Cater by phone a couple of times. This was 10 years ago. And he was living in an old folks' home. And, he wasn't so lucid at the time. But he was able to relate things like that. He related his friendship with Jim Bowen very nicely.
Wow. Yeah, that is super interesting to see something like a T-Rex. I mean, that is as foreign as an alien. I mean, that's the kind of story that you don't hear every day.
Well, yes, dinosaurs have supposedly been sighted in Venezuela. This is along the Venezuelan plateau. It would be southeastern Venezuela. It's an area which is not accessible. On the far side of the Venezuelan plateau, let's say, would be Angel Falls, and then Brazil, the Brazilian Amazon. It is Amazon there, the Venezuelan plateau. And what I know is that in the early 60s, it became fashionable among some of the very wealthy of Venezuela to go back in that area and engage in big game hunting. They have some kind of big game back there. I don't know what. I'm not saying they went hunting dinosaurs, but they sighted dinosaurs. People came back saying there are dinosaurs there. And this has been heard a lot. I lived 2 years in Venezuela. When I was, this was 1980, 79, 80, something like that. And I heard about this back then. But that dinosaurs had been sighted in that area, and that it's hard to go there, and that going there was discouraged by the government. But, take it or leave it. This is what the people, if you go there, this is what they'll tell you. And I've heard it from other sources too. This is where the Orinoco River goes, and in this part of Venezuela also the Amazon warriors were encountered by the Spaniards during the colonization period. And again, the Amazon warriors, they really do have this underground element attached to them. So I'm thinking that these dinosaurs, I'm thinking they don't exactly have their habitat on the surface, but that they come up at times. Just like snakes. Snakes are also reptiles. They live below the surface. They live in caves even, but they'll come out and bathe in the sun and look for food and whatever.
Yeah. So those are some interesting anecdotes for sure. And as we're getting towards the end of this, I really appreciate that you've done 2 hours, but this idea, I mean, if this is true and all the forms we're discussing, you realize this would be the mother of all conspiracies, right? I mean, this would be one of the ultimate secrets to have kept all these years, right?
Well, I think that there's a worldwide conspiracy much wider and just much more far-reaching than anybody could possibly fathom. I mean, let's relate it to another conspiracy. I was mentioning to you about the Venera spacecraft and the problems with accepting that this probe parachuted through the clouds, the Cloud Mantle, when in the atmosphere, when the atmosphere has a temperature of 950 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, I know that, And the Russians know that, and the Americans know that. NASA knows that. But they all keep their mouths shut. If the Russians and the Chinese really were ticked off with the Americans, they just want to let the American the American government, and they want to let the American people know what was happening with their government and the kind of shenanigans the American government pulls. They would just come out and tell people about Apollo and how Apollo was a hoax and explain why, and it wouldn't have taken 30 years for people to piece things together, So they're scratching each other's back. There's winks and nods when it comes to things like the space program. So what about the configuration of our planet? It's kind of hard to just come out and tell people whether or the source of our civilization is actually from the hollow world and we've broken away and that's our homeland and, things like that. I mean, they would lose control and all of the people from the surface can't go there anyway. And I don't know. What are they supposed to do? Of course, they're not telling us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually have thought about the idea. Well, it's clear the way the rulers rule is through fear and propaganda and misinformation. And it's interesting when I think back to a time when people thought the world was flat, when they thought the earth was flat, and the big scare was, oh, you don't want to venture too far from home, you might fall off the earth. And that just seems like a story you would tell someone that you wanted to keep under control. Like, I wonder if the leaders really believed the earth was flat, or if that's just something they were able to propagandize to keep a better thumb, to keep everybody under their thumb. And maybe the secrets of a hollow earth is just that to another level.
Well, I know you've made a very good analogy, and that's it. The monsters that rule this world, that are warmongers and that kill millions, they don't want us to know. At the same time, what about some sympathy for the devil? Because like I said, what are they supposed to do? There's this joke I've heard about the devil, that he's the devil, but one day the devil helped this old lady across the street because she had these packages, and he saw her struggling to get across the street, and he walked over and offered his services, picked up her packages, walked her home, dropped them off at her doorstep, and she offered him a tip, and he didn't want any money for it, and said, my pleasure, like that, and went on his way. So they say, well, he was the devil, but there was one time when even the devil did a good deed. He helped this lady across the street with her packages or whatever. So these people that run our world, they are monsters. I mean, they're killers. They're the architects of death on a huge scale. But by the same token, if they're going to be in charge, they have to run things. You have to be a good manager too. Mm-hmm. And again, we can't go there. The Hollow Earthers haven't invited us. I don't think they want us to come. The most that they did, 1,000 years ago, was send Santa Claus with some packages, but stay there.
Right.
And then what are they supposed to do? They can't lose control here. It's like life on the moon. If you tell people there's life on the moon, that there's a hollow moon, then you're going to lose control. The people are going to say, well, what about them? We want to hear from them. You're not letting us have contact with them. We want you to do this. Mm-hmm. We want you to get into contact and do that and the other. They would lose control. So I think we have to have little sympathy for the powers that be, although in other ways, I don't have much sympathy for them.
No.
I don't think the Hollow Earth understanding is for everybody.
Right.
Because of these difficulties.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say. It's a contradiction in terms, a conundrum that I have not been able to really solve. That here I am, I'm a Hollow Earth proponent, but I'll be the first one to say it's not for everybody. But I'll be the first one to say that you can skywrite it and you can put a full-page ad in the New York Times and don't lose any sleep. People are going to forget about it maybe a few weeks later, and it'll just, they won't do anything, Mm-hmm. I don't know what to say. There's a contradiction there, but what do you do?
Yeah, I love the theory. It's, to me, one of the most interesting. I'm deep in the conspiracy world, so I'm constantly still hearing about 9/11, hearing about the NSA, and these things are like so conspiracy 101 to me. And at the real depths, there is some some serious weirdness, and the Hollow Earth is down there in those depths, and I would so want it to be true, but in modern times, it's hard for me to rationalize, because we hear these stories of people in the 1500s to 1800s that are skirting around the entrance to the Hollow Earth and reporting back. But now, with modern technology and modern travel ability, we don't hear those accounts. I guess, and I understand that, believe me, the elite can cover up a lot. They really can. But with technology expanding to the everyman, it seems harder to keep a lid on this. Are there any stories of a concerted effort to cap some of these holes to the cavern worlds, or collapse some of these tunnels so that people can't access them?
Well, first of all, the hollow opening in the middle of the Arctic Ocean is really very inaccessible. There are film clips. It's like I say, you can do some skywriting and tell everybody above New York City about the hollow Earth. The Earth is hollow or something, and nothing's going to happen. So we have these film clips from radar sat that really do show the opening. You just have to stare at it and know what you're looking for. We have these film clips, satellite clips showing where the opening is in the Arctic, and also there's some good ones of the opening of Mars, the depression and everything there.
Because if our planet is hollow, you'd have to assume that they all follow that same formula.
Yes, for sure. But then it's a matter of hurry up and wait. I mean, you send things around on the internet, and every kook in the world is already sending things around. How can people distinguish?
Right.
And then, to Good Morning America, they're not going to give you any airtime.
Right.
So it's a secret, even though it's the best kept secret in the world, but it's right in front of us in many ways. Now, about attempts to cap the openings to cavern worlds, which the cavern worlds theme interests me very much, because it's right where we are. You don't have to travel across 2,000 miles of frozen Arctic wasteland in northern Canada and all that, and carry your fuel with you and food and survive the elements to get to where these cavern worlds are.
Right.
They're everywhere, and it's not just in the jungles of the Amazon. They're in North America. They're everywhere. For example, the Apache Indians were known for escaping through tunnels. They only fought one pitched battle with the cavalry. They would spring raids on the cavalry, usually from the mountains, from above, while the cavalry's in a canyon or something like that. And then they would run off through these tunnels and caves, and the cavalry would never catch up with them. And they would show up like on the other side of the border in Mexico 2 weeks later, something like that. And nobody saw them traveling across land. So this is very interesting. Now, right where the Apaches had their chief activity, where they were the most active, where they defended the most, and especially one area where they fought a pitched battle to keep the cavalry away, which is close to the Panamint Mountains, if I'm not mistaken. It's up there near Area 51. And it is an area where there are reports of tunnel entrances and cut steps into the rocks, and auditorium-sized rooms that opened up. But what went on during the early 70s, right in that area, something like, according to David Hatcher Childress, 25 miles from where the Apaches were most active, were the underground atomic explosions. So if there were cavern worlds in this area, and there were, the world of the Apaches or something like that was actually below the surface of the earth, or some cavern world was down there, at one point, we just weren't able to make peace with them or subjugate with them, and they did these underground atomic explosions. And the Russians did a few too. And then the Hindu Kush, which is known, I mean, that's where you have the most folklore about underground worlds, Shangri-La and that kind of thing. The Pakistanis engaged in some underground nuclear testing also. So all these people are enemies with each other, but they seem to have a common agenda, and they don't tell on each other. There's winks and nods. And again, the size and scope of the conspiracy is just still something that I cannot fathom.
Yeah, man. It drives me nuts myself all the time. I mean, we just talked about the Nevada desert, not far from where I live here in San Diego, and you're there in Brazil. There is a story of a modern story of the military investigating a super long tunnel system there in Brazil, right?
Right. I first became aware of this from the David Hatcher Childress interview on the Laura Lee show, and this was right around the turn of the millennium. And I was able to corroborate this. There is a group called Imagery, all one word, the letter I and magic, spelled G-I-K, I believe. If anyone wants to know, they can toy around with it. In the city of São Tomé das Letras, in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. And Imagic is just, it's a group of people who worship the elements. This one lady, she's a psychoanalyst. And they engage in Nordic ceremonies and things like that. And they have a retreat up there near this town, São Tomé das Letras. And she was able to, I went and visited her once because she also works in Sao Paulo, but they have like a weekend home there, 8 hours away. But she told me about this area. She told me about the city, São Tomé das Letras. It's a small town. And she told me about David Hatcher Childress. The town is a rock quarry. And there's also a lot of hippies there, let's say, that do arts and crafts. Now, there's a tunnel there, and it's called the Stamped Cave because of all the bat dung that lines the walls of the cave. Mm-hmm. And it's not a cave, it's a tunnel. It goes on a east and west axis line, and it's about 2 meters tall, about 1.5 meters wide, and it has a down-sloping gradient to it. And people have explored it a little bit, but one day the Brazilian army was sent there to explore this cave, this tunnel, because this is very unusual. It's not natural. It was cut. Mm-hmm. And they went through it for several days. I mean, they were gone a total of like 10 days or 2 weeks, something like that. And it just went straight on down. They came to a big room, maybe the size of an auditorium or the size of a house or something like that. And there was a north branch off seemed very much north, straight north, due north, south, and also west. Since they were coming from the east, they stayed there and rested for a little bit, and then they continued west for about 2 more days. And they came to this very big chasm, and it looked too difficult to get across. Their supplies were going low, so they decided to come back, and they went back. And that's been the end of it. Any kind of caving or spelunking or expedition or exploring in caves is... there are laws that govern it. You need permission. There's a ministry of, it comes under the Ministry of Mining, caving. And, you get the police on you and you go to jail if you engage in any unauthorized caving.
I imagine.
So no one's really, go ahead.
I imagine that's how they keep the secret these days. That's how they keep the guard. Just use that legal framework to scare people out and have consequences for entering.
Yeah, because it would be so hard to keep it secret. the supplies you'd have to have outside. You need generators and trucks and people and radios and wires and things like that to keep in contact with your people. You couldn't keep it secret. Now, this one lady with iMagic, she told me that when they would go horseback riding up there in the area, there were areas where you would go galloping across or trotting across with the horses, and they could tell that the ground below them was hollow, that they were traveling across some rock or something like that, but it wasn't very thick. And she said that that's very interesting, and that the farmers up there, the hacienda owners, the plantation owners, they don't let people browse around on their property or go through the caves either. As a general rule, they all band together and they don't allow that.
Yeah, that sucks, man. You know, I'm feeling like I want to be the next Indiana Jones and try to get in there somehow. I mean, if you were going to try, like, let me ask you, if you were going to advise someone as to how to best access the inner earth or these caverns or discover something sensational, where would you tell them to try? If you had to speculate.
I really think I would tell them not to try. I mean, I wouldn't tell them to try, because there are beings in there like orcs or goblins or hobbits.
Don't you want to come face to face with something like that?
Not 3 miles below the surface of the earth. And it's just me, and then there's an army of orcs. I've read the 3rd chapter of The Hobbit when they're in the mountain there and they're being chased by the orcs in the dark. And all they have are a couple of swords with them. I mean, it's very dangerous to think along those lines. And here I am, I'm the proponent, and I'm telling people, oh no, don't do that, don't go down there. But what can you say? These worlds are inhabited.
Maybe that's why they call it Middle Earth, middle of the earth. But I just want that personal proof, you know? I would just love to see that personal proof.
Yeah, I know. I know. I've thought about it a lot. I even thought of taking like a motorcycle and going into that cave in San Tomé das Letras, because it's a straight gradient, right? And just going downhill as far as I could go. Maybe I could go 50 or 100 miles and just bring a lot of gasoline, like get a big motorcycle and rig it to carry all this gasoline on the back or something. But I mean, these are like some wild ideas I had in the beginning. But now I just don't know what to say. I even saw a drawing of an elf a while back. And the elf had the elf ears and everything and the human-like face. But it was a very demoniac face. It was like half human and half animal and kind of sinister. And I was thinking, my God, that just like smashed one of my cherished concepts, that the elves were very beautiful and they dance in elf circles. And they have these pointed ears, and the elf ladies are very beautiful, and they're enchantresses and things like that. But these are the romanticized ideas that we have. These beings that live below, they don't seem to be so friendly.
I wonder if that's where those stories come from. Elves and fairies and goblins. I wonder if they're all down there in those cavern worlds.
Yeah, that's the impression that I have. That's their habitat. For sure, it's described that way in the folklore, that they're from these places. There were a few Englishmen that made their way down there and were allowed to come back. You know, there was the story of one Englishman, and I don't remember all the names and dates and things like that, but his wife was kidnapped, which is typical. And like Beowulf, he went down into the cave and he didn't give a damn. And he came face to face with them, and he said he wanted his wife back. And they said, okay, come with us, and you'll be given a chance. And they brought him to this king of these really goofy-looking, I don't know how to describe them, people, like, I don't know, maybe leprechaun size or something like that. But I saw a drawing, a depiction of it, and they seem to be very goofy-looking. But the king was sitting on a throne, and there were 50 women in a line, and they were all identical. You know, genetic cloning has a lot to do. Like these people, these Greys and the UFOs, they're coplanetarians. They're from below the surface, and they're still engaged in kidnapping women, extracting the egg, and genetic manipulation. But this man was told that among these 50 or so women, he had to choose which one was truly his wife and which one was not a clone. And they all said, "It's me. Don't believe the other ones. Oh my God, I can't believe it. I mean, it's me. Get me out of here, please. I love you," and like that. But they all said the same thing, and they all knew things about his life.
Interesting.
And yeah, he chose the right one, and he was allowed to leave.
Huh.
But for the one who chose right, I mean, there were probably 49 other opportunities in which the man chose wrong, and he had to stay down there and become a human slave or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
So we get the tip of the iceberg, but these are the things that you hear, you know. That's what goes on down there.
Right. Man, it has been a fascinating talk, man, a much longer show than I'm used to, but I'm so glad we could take the time to tackle this subject pretty completely. I mean, are there any other bits of information you'd like to add to get the attention of some of those people that might still be on the fence? I mean, this idea flies in the face of everything we've been taught for decades. It's hard to reverse that with just one conversation, but is there anything you'd leave the people with?
All I can say is investigate it.